Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this fifth webinar of the Silk Case series. My name is Jagannath Panda. I head the ISDP's South Asian Indo-Pacific Affairs Center. Today, we'll be discussing about China and Hormuz. And this particular webinar is a part of our Silk Case series, and it is titled as Hormuz in the Silk Cage, China's Choke Point Strategy by 2030 to 2035. This discussion today takes us to one of the world's most critical maritime space, that is the Strait of Hormuz. As you know, the Strait of Hormuz has been in the news for the Iran, Israel, and US war. But this particular strait is increasingly emerging not only as an energy choke point, but also as a critical theater for strategic competition and geopolitical influence. If we try to understand the criticality of this choke point, one important point that deserves attention is that China's engagement in the Strait of Hormuz is no longer what it used to be. Many perceives or misperceives by saying that China's engagement with Hormuz is merely about securing oil supplies. But if you see it increasingly, I think China is building a wider strategic architecture through ports, logistics, corridors, maritime infrastructure, telecommunication networks, and political partnerships in the regions, particularly in the Gulf regions. So therefore, the key question here is whether China is gradually converting economic dependence into long-term geopolitical leverage. Also, if we go into the details of this Hormuz politics in the context of the war, what we are seeing that in the post-Iran war, the regional environment has added a kind of new complexity, new layer of uncertainty and strategic fluidity. Iran, Pakistan, other Gulf monarchies, and also the broader Indian Ocean dynamics are also interconnected with this war and with this choke point. And that is also shaping China's maritime behavior and also strategic behavior in the regions. What is also further interesting to see that what happens in Hormuz will not only affect China alone. There are implications for various countries in the regions, for India, for Japan, South Korea, Europe, including for the United States, which is increasingly involved in the war itself. So Hormuz is increasingly becoming a test case of how future global order, maritime order, connectivity politics, and strategic competition is going to evolve by 2030 and 2035. But what about China? How the Chinese are looking at the Strait of Hormuz? In order to discuss some of this point, we have a fantastic set of experts. Just to start with, their profile is there in ISDP website. You could actually go to our website and see their detailed profile. They are public personals and expert. They hold many years of expertise with themselves. But to start with, we have Dr. Gedalia Afterman. He is the head of Asia Policy Program at the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and International Relations in Israel. He is also Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research. And he's a fantastic writer. He's also affiliated, he's a fellow at the Center for Advanced Security, Strategy and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. He's also a lecturer at Risman and Tel Aviv University. And he keeps on writing in many forums. Then we have Lieutenant General retired In-Bom Chun. He is actually a senior fellow for the Association of the United States Army, president of the Society for Army Alliance Korea, president of the Korea AI Security Association, and a board member of the Korea Animal Welfare Association. General Chun is a public figure and a very highly regarded expert from South Korea. Most importantly, he is currently with Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm with us as a distinguished visiting fellow sponsored by the Korea Foundation. So as a Korea Foundation fellow, General Chun has been quite busy in terms of delivering lectures and engaging in public debates on some of these issues. And his columns, his writings in Korea Times and in other international forums are very well known. So, and then we have Dr. Nora Huang. Dr. Nora is actually the Director of International Relations and Research Fellow at the Prospect Foundation, which is a semi-official think tank in Taiwan. Her research focuses on Taiwan-U.S. relations, U.S.-China relations. She writes, quite frequently on Taiwan's foreign policy, regional security issues, and also she's engaged with ISDP in a couple of projects. And you could see her also speaking in various international forums. She received her PhD from National Taiwan University, and she has been also very closely working with the different think tanks and institutions in Taiwan. Then we have really a well-known China specialist, Dr. Dominik Maciejewski. He is an associate professor at the University of Łódź in Poland. Professor Dominik actually leads the Department of Asian Studies and the Center for Asian Affairs, which is a university of affiliated think tank and specializing on China's political discourse, China's international behavior. He has most recently published a fantastic book on China and Chinese foreign policy, covering the third world politics or the emerging economies, emerging powers dynamics in Routledge, and he's author of many well-known international books. Last but not least, we have Dr. Christian Alexander, who is a senior fellow and lead researcher at the Rabdan Institute for Security and Defense Research, Abu Dhabi. Dr. Christian is an advisor at Gulf Straits Analytics, a Washington-based geopolitical risk consultancy. He has been a senior fellow with the Trends Consultancy, and he has been also teaching in various colleges and universities in UAE and outside. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen, and Dr. Nora, to you, especially being the only female speaker in the panel. But yes, we'll start with you, Gedalia, because as Israel is one of those power which is critically involved in the war. So how do you really see, particularly the future of Hormuz, primarily from the China's point of view? We have seen in this particular war, and particularly in the Hormuz crisis, that the Chinese have relatively taken a backseat. They have, of course, tactically supported Iran, but again, they have taken a backseat. But in the Strait of Hormuz, their ships has not really faced the same problem what other ships and other consignments in the Strait of Hormuz has faced. So your initial reaction, 5 to 7 minutes, then we'll go to other speakers. Over to you, Gedalia.
Thanks so much, Jagannath. I'm happy to be here and to join such a great list of speakers as well. As you said, as you mentioned, China, at least on the face of it, has been relatively passive in the current Iran war, and specifically around the Strait of Hormuz. We saw at some stage President Trump actually calling or asking China to join the efforts to open the Strait, and that didn't happen. We saw, on the other hand, that China reached an agreement with the Iranians that allowed Chinese vessels and vessels that were heading to China free passage through at least the Iranian blockage. So I'll try and explain at least the way I think China looks at this conflict in a few short minutes. So obviously, from Chinese perspective, I would say that this is not only an energy choke point. It's a combination. Energy security, of course, is important, but it's also about China's geopolitical influence. And I would say also more specifically about China-US competition and China-US competition, first of all, in the Gulf, in the Middle East, but I think it also is related to the Indo-Pacific and other regions around the world. So to the first point, first of all, energy security. China in recent years has diversified its energy dependence, its energy sources. It's also changing its economy to be less oil dependent. But the truth is that it's still substantially dependent on energy from the Gulf. So this is not a theoretical issue for China, right? So if you block the Strait of Hormuz, even though China has oil reserves, etc., this has an impact on China. So that's one thing, and that's why we saw China was quick to secure the agreement that I just mentioned with the Iranian to enable the ongoing flow of Iranian oil, right? So that positioned China, at least for the first part of the war, the first half of the war, in a pretty comfortable position. But on the other hand, it's not only about oil, right? It's about shaping the environment around the choke point. So China is not only thinking in the very narrow sense of, okay, how can I get my energy through? It's how can I shape the environment around it to secure Chinese practices? And I think the agreement that we saw was a very good example of this. So when we're thinking about Chinese influence or Chinese control of the Hormuz Straits, we're not talking in military sense, right? It's not the same game as the Americans are playing. We're not counting how many naval ships China has in the region or how does it open the strait. It doesn't use military means to do so. It's using its presence in the region, it's using its influence on Iran, and it's using its ability to operate within this complicated uh, geopolitical, even I would say war, to move forward. And I think that gives China quite a unique position because it's not trying to play the role, a security guarantor role. It comes out as an economic power that can influence strategic dynamics. And I think what we've seen in recent months is, or in the last 2 months or so, is that China has been quite effective in doing so, at least in the case of Hormuz. So if you look at it from a Chinese perspective, it's quite different to the American perspective on this issue. America is using military force to shape the environment, to open the Strait of Hormuz or take control of the Strait of Hormuz, where the Chinese say, I'm not going to play this strategic game, right? I'm going to use economic influence, political influence to reach these results. I don't have to have skin in the game, but still, I will probably be the country benefiting the most or getting as much energy as possible using the means that I have. And I think if we look at it, if we take a step back and look at it, I think again that that's, especially in contrast to the American model, is proving fairly effective at the moment. And that's quite important because when you look at these models and you're trying to understand, there's many people ask, who's winning the war? Which superpower is in a better position? I think in that sense, you can see that I would say that China is in some ways feeling more comfortable or losing less in the current war. So when we're looking forward and we're trying to think about the future, and I'll talk about it more in the next questions, but I think that's the kind of framing that we need to think about. How does China use geoeconomic strengths, right, geoeconomic influence to shape the environment in a way that it needs to invest less, it doesn't need to take risks, but it still manages to get what it needs, right, to secure its energetic and other interests in the region. And this is not only about the immediate results, this is about positioning itself for the days after the war. So China will continue using this position that it has to position itself in the day after the war, both in the Strait of Hormuz and with other economic, infrastructure, technological relationships in the region. I'll stop here and I'm happy to jump more into more detail in the next rounds.
Excellent, Gedalia. And I do agree with you. Your point is very well taken. I think the Chinese outlook towards Strait of Hormuz is slightly different from the American model. That's look at the long term, looking at the economic and political benefits they could generate in between. With this note, let me invite General Chun to you for your initial remarks for to 5 to 7 minutes. As a distinguished visiting fellow of the Korea Foundation, I'm sure you are looking some of these issues very closely. So it would be interesting to hear your thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you again for this opportunity. I think the Iran incursion that has occurred by the United States and assisted by Israel has caused a realization by countries like Korea, but more importantly by the Korean people, as to the impact of such a situation that might occur not in the Strait of Hormuz, but in the Strait of Taiwan. So for Korea uh, and Koreans, they've always tried to think that there would be somehow a possibility that the Koreans could be neutral in a situation where Taiwan Straits would be either blockaded, quarantined, or outright war were to occur, that somehow that the Koreans would be able to stay out of such a situation. But I think Hormuz has awakened the Korean people into the realization that the impact of such a situation is so grave that we just can't stay out. And I think this is a good wake-up call for the Koreans. This comes in the light of what's happening in Ukraine. Despite the Ukraine situation caused by the Russians, the Korean people have a short memory, but it's not just the Koreans, is it? Everybody does. But now, with what's happening in Hormuz with Iran, we now realize that the impacts of such a situation will be dear and grave, and there's just no way of sitting out on such a catastrophe. I'm quite concerned that government, on the other hand, is not trying to educate and look straight forward into the situation and openly talk about the consequences. If you look at Korean media, they're criticizing the present U.S. administration with American media outlet announcements and reporting. And this is quite sorrowing for me to see that the United States cannot unite under one flag, which is very concerning because for me as a Korean and as a person who is focused on security, I desperately need a very strong United States. And this leads to the third observation that I have, which is it's critical, not because I like or dislike Mr. Trump or I support a strong America, but the fact that countries like Korea and many of us and where we live is a better situation if we have a strong United States. And it's unfortunate that this war had to begin. And I won't go into the details about how I feel, who really started this, but it's already begun. And it is in my best interest to see the United States / the Trump administration reach all of its goals, which I understand is the total denuclearization of Iran and now the free access of the Hormuz Strait. If any of these are not met, I feel it is not in the best interest of the free world. Thank you.
General Chun, thank you very much. And I think that was a very well articulated Korean perspective. But we would like to hear more thoughts from you on China. How is the Korean media looking at it, and the Korean general strategic communities are looking at China? China's role not only in the Strait of Hormuz but also in the war. If you could throw some lights in the second and in the subsequent round, that would be great for the context of this discussion. We will come back to you again. Dr. Nora, over to you. I'm sure Taiwan is watching the war and also the politics in the Hormuz very closely. What's your initial thoughts about China? How the Chinese are playing this waiting game in the Strait of Hormuz? Initial thoughts, maybe 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event and to share some thoughts and observations about the current situation in the Strait of Hormuz. And I think I am echoing Dr. Abderman's first remarks about China's relatively patience in this situation. But I want to point it out that I think that patience in the facade actually reflects there's limitation of China's influences in the Middle East, and especially in the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. I look into the Chinese strategy on choke points. Basically, they wanted to offset the effects of choking and also by building the bypass routes, and or by building their relationship with those local countries in order to mitigate the potential damages of a choking effect. And I think in the Strait of Hormuz, because we see China hasn't built its post along the sea land for it to project its military power. So relatively, China can now only leverage its diplomatic relations with Iran, try to manage the damage of a choking on the Strait of Hormuz. We all know that the dependency on oil energy supplying from Middle East for China is not particularly high in comparison to some of those other Asian neighbors, such as South Korea and Japan and the South Asian countries. Their dependencies on energy going through the Strait of Hormuz could come up to 80%, 90%. But for China, it's about 30 to 50%, considering its oil and gas. And also, because China builds a very high volume of strategic petroleum reserves, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, China currently possess officially, from the government side, officially possess 1.4 billion barrels of this reserve. So it accounts for at least 7 months consumption of its oil consumption. That gives China a longer time frame to wait for this situation to be resolved. So in one way, China has the depth to be more patient. In another way, because I think China, because he doesn't have the kind of projection power currently, and the only thing that he can leverage mostly is through its relations with Iran. So we can see when at first the Iranian regime imposed the blockade on Strait of Hormuz, the oil comes from Iran does not stop. It continued to get through the Strait of Hormuz and reach to Asia and to China. But only until the U.S. Navy imposed the counter blockade on the Iranian export. That is when the situation affects China more than before. So I see, from my point of view, is that China definitely wanted to build up its leverages to taking care of those strategic choke points. But currently, there's limitations for China. But because of China is a very good student and plans very long way, so he already builds up a very big volume of the strategic petroleum reserve that gives him time to wait for the situation to be resolved. And so we see earlier there's media reports about the Iranian officials told the reporters that the Chinese are encouraging them to sit down the negotiating table with the US. In a way, outside world may think that the Chinese wanted to resolve the situation because even though China has a big reserve to tackle the situation, but the Chinese would be more concerned about the effect on the overall global economy. We all know China is an export-oriented economy. Its growth model depends on the global economy very much. So once the economic effects biting into the overall global economy, it would go back to hurt China more than choking the supply of energy. So I would see China wanted to prevent the choking, sent the world economy into the downturn train. So at some point, he wanted to try to mitigate the risk of that trade. But we need to taking care of another concern and demand from the Chinese side. We see, I think you all remember when once the Chinese meeting its European counterparts, the foreign minister Wang Yi told the European counterparts that they are kind of supporting the Russians because they don't want if the Russian is dealt with, and then the U.S. and its allies would have the attention and the resources to tackle China. So the narrative of these evil A6 that constitutes by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, there's some point there, and China knows it. It's a strategic thinking there. So China wanted to maintain good relations with those ASIC partners by supporting them in a more blurring way. So we've seen in the past couple of decades that China been helping Iran to avoid the sanctions and by purchasing its oil. So in this event, China also wanted to maintain these relations with Iran. So by encouraging the Iranians to sit down the negotiation table, it looks like not only like helping the U.S. to deal with the situation currently happening, but also helping Iran as well. We know Iran used to take this to imply this tactic of buying time by negotiating with its counterparts. So in this situation, Iran also enjoyed the benefit of continued negotiation, while in this processes that he can buy time to regroup and mitigate the problems and challenges that he's facing under the situation of a U.S. Navy blockade. So I would see China is currently relatively patient, but he wanted to make sure that come out from the negotiation, Iran's current regime will remain in power. And that means the relations they've nurtured for the past few decades will remain be influential in the future. Yeah, I just stop here.
Excellent comments. I think broadly I agree with you. China, on the one hand, trying to prevent the conflict, but at the same time, it is very careful not to lose out any, gaining any strategic advantage in the regions. We will come back to you with more comments and questions. But let me invite Dominic to share your views. You have been watching China for a number of years, nearly for 2 decades. How do you really see the Chinese approach to the Strait of Hormuz in coming times, particularly after the war has broken out?
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be in such a wonderful, with such a wonderful audience. And well, I see there are no big difference how China reacts to conflicts across the globe. Usually, China portrays itself as a neutral, benevolent power, and since, for example, 9/11, China is playing this game pretty well and building its positive image, particularly across developing countries, and translating this, that we stable, particularly right now when China needs to confront Trump and uncertainty with the American government. China is looking to global south, so-called, to promote its positive image. And that's the first observations from my side. The second is, if you just look into bilateral relations between China and Tehran, according to my understanding, the Chinese try to have a very stable, relatively predictable government in Iran because of its peripheral diplomacy. And if you just look into bilateral relations and bilateral statements, strategic partnerships signed by both governments between 2016 and 2023, it's very obvious that Tehran is seen as a part of regional order, and China backs Iran's legitimate regional position as an actor that helped China to stabilize Afghanistan. And together with Pakistan, both countries play an important role in shaping China's peaceful neighborhood. And I think this is critical. Fully agree with what Professor Huang said. I mean, they're looking into the global economy, true, absolutely, because the model of Chinese political economy is export-led economy. However, at the same time, they need to stabilize the region of South Asia. And if you just look into the declaration signed 2023, really, Iran is a part of regional order. Persian Gulf, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, the whole Middle East, plus Afghanistan. And looking into this, I guess China needs to support Iran, not because of the interest in the Gulf countries and in the Middle East, but in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan as a regional security issue is a part of conversation with the United States to a certain degree in United Nations Security Council, particularly last year, but also with Russia, with Pakistan. And they have this four parties format to stabilize Afghanistan. If you just look into a refugees crisis, I mean, China is really afraid of so-called of spillover pressure. So as I check media, Associated Press reported that at least 1.2 million Afghans were forced to return from Iran and Pakistan in 2025. It's really make an issue for the Chinese diplomacy how to secure China's core interest, that is territorial integrity and Xinjiang autonomous region. And from my perspective, Iran is not only, as I said, about big politics, but securing China's neighborhood within China's peripheral diplomacy. And I stop here.
No, excellent points. I completely agree with you. The way China looks at global South, its extended neighboring, and particularly the relationship with Iran, and then you bringing out about the territorial issues, particularly linking it with Xinjiang issue, is very interesting. And I think this is where probably they have been planning to work for a long, long time. But we will come back to you with some comments on some of these issues. But last but not the least, Christian, you are based in UAE. What are you hearing the debates about China, and how do you really observe the Chinese are really looking at the Strait of Hormuz after this crisis?
Thank you, Jagannath. Yeah, from a Gulf and particular UAE perspective, obviously the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a maritime choke point; it's central artery of Gulf economic survival, state stability, and international relevance. I mean, roughly 1/5 of globally traded oil and significant LNG volumes pass through this narrow corridor. For the Gulf states, obviously, Hormuz is therefore not just an abstract geopolitical issue, it's existential. China increasingly views the Strait of Hormuz through a similar strategic lens, I would argue, although for different reasons. So Beijing's concern is not territorial control in a traditional military sense. Rather, China seeks predictability, uninterrupted energy flows, diversified supply chains, and strategic insulation from external coercion. From a Gulf perspective, China's growing interest in Hormuz reflects the reality that GCC has become indispensable to Beijing's long-term energy security calculations. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman collectively represent a foundational pillar of China's imported energy architecture. So Beijing understands that any prolonged disruption in Hormuz would directly affect Chinese industrial output, manufacturing stability, shipping insurance costs, and domestic growth. At the same time, China's vulnerability is not simply about physical oil shortages. I mean, Beijing is increasingly, as I mentioned earlier, concerned about price shocks, shipping disruptions, manufacturing slowdowns, and supply chain instability. So even if China is somewhat insulated through strategic reserves, supplier diversification, renewable energy expansion, nuclear energy development, and electrical vehicle adoption, it remains deeply exposed to prolonged instability in the Strait. So Beijing now sees the Gulf as a logistical, financial, digital, technological, and maritime connectivity hub linking Asia, Africa, and Europe. So in this regard, Hormuz fits into China's broader connectivity security strategy. And that's where initiatives associated with the Belt Road Initiative become important. I think while many discussions reduce the Belt Road initiatives to infrastructure construction, Beijing actual long-term vision is much broader. I think it seeks resilient corridors, ports, digital systems, logistic networks, industrial zones, energy routes, telecommunication infrastructure, and financial partnerships, which would then reduce vulnerability to strategic shocks. So I think from a UAE perspective, this aligns with Abu Dhabi's own ambitions. The UAE increasingly positions itself as a middle power, logistical state, and maritime stabilizer. So Chinese investment in Emirati ports, free zones, industrial parks, renewable energy projects, AI infrastructure reflects this convergence of interests, one could say. Of course, there is somewhat of an important nuance from the Gulf side. GCC states generally do not want China to militarize its Hormuz role in a manner that transforms the Gulf into another arena of direct US-China rivalry. Gulf governments in general, I would say, prefer strategic diversification, not strategic substitution. So in other words, they seek deeper economic engagement with China without completely replacing the US-led security architecture that has historically underpinned maritime stability. Of course, this creates an interesting paradox. China benefits enormously from US naval protection of sea lanes in the Gulf while simultaneously trying to reduce dependence on US-controlled maritime systems over the long term. I would argue that from Beijing's perspective, this dependency represents strategic vulnerability. I mean, from the Gulf perspective, however, a complete erosion of US maritime presence could itself generate instability and uncertainty. I think another important point is that China's approach to Hormuz differs significantly from Iran's approach. Iran often frames the strait in coercive or deterrence-oriented terms as leverage during periods of confrontation that we've recently witnessed. China, by contrast, I think fundamentally prefers the strait to remain open, I think commercially functional, insulated from military escalation. So I think Beijing's interests are therefore more status-oriented than revolutionary. Important recent developments suggest that China is becoming somewhat less passive regarding Gulf security crises. During recent tensions, I think Beijing explicitly emphasized that the Hormuz should remain open and called for restraint on all sides. So from a Gulf's perspective, this signaled that China increasingly sees disruption in Hormuz as a direct threat to Chinese national interests rather than merely a distant regional problem. For Gulf states, the issue is therefore not whether China will replace the United States as the primary security guarantor in the region. I think that's remains unlikely in the foreseeable future. The more realistic scenario is that China becomes a political and economic architect of a more diversified regional order while the United States continues to provide much of the hard security umbrella. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Interesting points you have raised. And I think the way Chinese are looking at the entire security architecture in the region, factoring Iran, that is something we need to really discuss a little more clearly and also deeply. And I think before we go for the second round, let me also suggest to all of you, please have a look at the Q&A box. There are questions. Also, those participants who have found their precious time to attend and listen to our experts here, please pose your questions in the Q&A box so that they can see it and answer you in the subsequent round. Now, let me start with you, Dominic, first. And I think you have been following China very closely. A couple of things. When we look the Chinese behavior and action plan, both in the war as well as in the Strait of Hormuz, one comparison comes to my mind, initially as the way the Chinese have looked at Pakistan all these years and the way Chinese are going to look at Iran from now on. Pakistan has always been a classic case. The Chinese have gradually made Pakistan to become a dependent state, a kind of client state, dependent, subordinate state. How about the case of Iran? If the war continues, there is a group of thinkers and geostrategists, they are arguing that if the war continues, then Iran becomes a weaker power what it used to be. And that is actually going to act in favor of China. And gradually the Chinese would like to see a weaker Iran and being dependent on China. How do you really see the ties with Iran? And in the context of Belt and Road Initiative, particularly when there is a China-Pakistan economic corridor is there, how the Chinese are really, trying to make each of this country being dependent on them. How do you really see this situation emerging from here on?
Well, this is truly a tough question. Well, one thing what I realized looking into sources currently in the Chinese media, and particularly in the Chinese embassy activities within in Iran, Ambassador Zhong Peiwu, for the first time, I guess, he placed Iran as a part of China's global initiatives. So it's not only about BRI, but I guess they try to use Iran, weaker or not weaker. I mean, this is a big question because, as I said previously, for them they need a rather stable government in order to accommodate the refugee crisis from Afghanistan. This is the priority. Otherwise, they might really face a huge problems inside Xinjiang Autonomous Region I mentioned. Yes. So from this perspective, I'm not sure, and I'm not really in this argument that they really need a weak country, as you said. However, when it comes to the current question, the current situation, they really use this in order to undermine the US role in the Middle East. And this was practically visible in the United Nations Security Council. When you just look into Ambassador Fuzong's declaration that, well, Iran is a victim of illegal force, is not a nuclear threat, plus stepping down to the discussions in Geneva in the Human Rights Council. This is also particularly in the interest of mine currently when I'm conducting a project on China in the United Nations. They really try to portray, a violation of human rights and international humanitarian law as a part of the conversation with developing countries. So I don't have a clue, to be honest, whether they really do prefer to have a weaker government in Tehran. I don't think that way. They need rather stable government in order to be part of the conversation with Russia, with Pakistan, and as a part of the peripheral diplomacy to stabilize the region. And this is my understanding. Plus, just referring to energy security, I guess one point is really missed, and this is a domestic structure of China's energy market. And I will not go into details maybe now, but from my perspective, it's really critical to understand that the crisis in the Middle East touched Guangdong province particularly. And Guangdong province in the southern of China is an engine of Chinese economy. If you just look into the energy prices across the province, not the whole country, I mean, Guangdong is an economy of South Korean size. And once Guangdong is touched by the crisis and disruption in oil supply chains, etc., it's really influenced the whole economy of China. But maybe I will go deeper down with this question after the next round. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Gedalia, may I invite you to comment? I'm sure there must be a lot of discussion about the future of Iran in Israel. Of course, from Israel's point of view, you would like to see, if not a weaker Iran, at least a stable Iran, which does not really pose a threat, security concern to Israel and to the regions. But the way the war is unfolding, definitely, probably there is a school of thoughts which believes that Iran is facing a lot of loss of lives and damages. Probably it will make Iran a weaker state, what it used to be. So your thoughts about how China would really look at Iran in times to come, and how the China-Iran relationship is going to unfold in your point of view, or from most of the point of view of Israel.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would say this. I think that China has been thinking of Iran as weakening not only since the war. I think, relatively speaking, China has been seeing Iran as weaker over the last 10 to 5 years, or 5 to 10 years. More generally, I think we've seen China's strategic calculations in the Gulf shift, where in the last decade or so, especially in the last 5 years, the Arab Gulf states have become more important strategically for China, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, for different reasons. Part of the reason is that the relationships in the region are not only about buying oil, right? Oil is, of course, important, but increasingly we've seen China shift to playing a different game. It's about infrastructure, it's about investment, it's about technology, it's about green energy. And when you think about the future, when you think 20 years ahead, and all of these countries offer China a lot strategically, and Iran doesn't really have much to offer, especially under sanctions. So gradually we've seen before the war, Iran being, I would say, downgraded in Chinese priorities. Now, of course, Iran does play a strategic role in Chinese thinking because at least until recently, it was a vacuum in the sense that in a very US-dominated region, Iran was an important country where China has the relationship, but not the United States. During the war itself, I mean, you asked a very interesting question, whether or not China wants a weaker Iran. I tend to agree with Dominique that I'm not sure it wants a weaker Iran, but I would say that China is not wedded to the Iranian regime. So if the state, as long as the regime in Iran is stable, then at least in principle, I don't see that the Chinese would go to great lengths to protect the Islamic regime, the current regime in Iran. But at the moment, we will have to wait and see what happens in the next few days and weeks. At the moment, we're kind of in an in-between phase. And in that sense, I think, again, we've seen China's diplomatic efforts being emphasizing its relationships in the Gulf, and that's maybe connects to what Christian said. So you had the special envoy, Jai Jun, who spent a lot of time meeting all the Gulf countries and visiting all the Gulf countries, but he didn't visit Iran, and he didn't visit Israel for that matter. And he spent a lot of time explaining to Gulf countries that China understands and is sympathized with them being under attack. And we mentioned the Hormuz straits needing to be open, etc. So I don't think China's Middle East strategy is Iran-centric. And I think it's important to understand that. I think this kind of discussion about the axis that is important, I'm not sure about it. I think China's relationship with Iran is quite different to Russia's relationship with Iran, for example. And I would also mention, Jagannath, that Iran is already completely dependent on China, right? China buys 90% of Iranian oil. Economically, is completely dependent, and China has been playing with that, right? So rather than maximizing its economic investments and projects in Iran, China has been rather selective. We've heard a lot of talk in recent years about the $400 billion strategic, 25-year strategic agreement between China and Iran, but the reality of it, that most of it hasn't been implemented. And that's, generally speaking, a Chinese decision because it's better to invest that money in other places. And like I said, strategically, I think Iran has become less important. But this is not only about Iran. This is not only about the bilateral relationship between China and Iran. It's much broader, has to do with the Middle East becoming a strategic, I would say, theater also for superpower competition increasingly. And the dynamic, we can see what we're seeing now at the moment is how does China position itself with the US, right? And one of the things that was interesting is to see, Nora, you mentioned this, that China encouraged the Iranians or called on the Iranians to negotiate with the Americans. That was seen positively by President Trump. And we have to remember that President Trump and President Xi meant to meet in Beijing in a week or so. So it's all about looking at the positioning of the two. And I think China's position with Iran, China's position in the Middle East in general, is actually bringing it to the table next week in a better position, right? It has more to offer. It can use the negotiation, it can use its access, or at least its ability to, I would say, pressure Iran economically as a card in its discussion with the United States, and I think it will at least try to do so. From an Israeli perspective, I know this is not about Israel. I don't think any of these outcomes are very positive because I think Israel went into this war hoping to see a dramatic shift in Iran and to see a regime change, which I don't think we're going to see, at least not in the immediate term. And then the question is, if we have a result that it's 60% or 70%, what does that mean for the future? What does that mean for America's role in the future or for the American model in the future? I think that when Gulf states look at the moment at the situation, yes, they need more security, that's for sure. But the Chinese economic model is also more attractive, creating new energy routes, creating more infrastructure. So I think we have an interesting dynamic between the superpowers moving ahead after the war.
Yeah. Thank you, Gedalia. I think those are great points. I'll come back to you, General Chun. How do you really see the China debates unfolding in Seoul, particularly on the war on Iran and its future relationship with Iran, and also how the Chinese are planning to secure their passages in the Strait of Hormuz in times to come, particularly by 2030 or 35? Your thoughts from Seoul.
Yeah, so, I'm more interested in what kind of lessons that the Chinese are learning from this ongoing conflict right now. On the one hand, as some of the presenters have mentioned, it's not in the best interest of Chinese internal political economic stability to have a situation in Hormuz, let alone in the Straits of Taiwan. But the Chinese are most likely looking at this and from a CCP perspective. And from the engagements that I have had with the CCP is very ideological and traditional, and their thinking is that you need to be strong and you need to be in a position of strength, and it is the destiny of the Chinese people to have a hegemonic role in the world. And because of this kind of thinking, I believe that despite all the rational arguments about China and Taiwan and the current Iran situation, China is learning again that the United States is a opponent that it might be able to deal with. In other words, that it might be able to defeat. And that's why, again and again, I feel that the United States must achieve its goals here in this conflict. Right now, the presenters have laid out a variety of wide reasons and situations concerning the Hormuz, but the bottom line is we cannot allow the Iranians to control not only their side of the coast, but the international waters that everybody has the right to use. And I think this is a test bed where we cannot, there's no room for negotiations. This is something that has to occur. And the United States needs to ensure that this rule is kept, or the world that we live in will not be able to exist at all. Now, the real question for Korea and other countries is how much are we going to get involved? I know that it's Korea and other nations are very reluctant to do so, but the fact of the matter is that it is in our best interest to make sure that international waters are free. And if we don't commit now, what happens when Taiwan or other critical choke points around the world, which there are many, are again threatened by nations that have wrong ideas about the kind of world that we should be living in? So I think that's very important for us. Korea and Iranian relations are very long. We have a street in Korea that is named after Tehran. There's a street in Tehran that is named after Korea. And so, despite the fundamental changes in Iran, many Koreans view Iran as the Iran that we saw in the 70s and 80s. And I think, despite all the economic benefits that both countries share, we, the Koreans, need to understand that despite all the economic benefits, we cannot deal with criminals.
Right.
Or should not.
Thank you, General Chun. I think your earlier point that the Chinese act would like to see from a position of strength. That's how they would look at the future of Iran and also their relationship with Iran. That's a very good point to take. And your point about CCP is ideological and traditional in its outlook. That is also a very strong point in the context of their relationship with Iran in particularly. I will have some subsequent comments on this, but let me invite Norasan to you. How do you really see China looking at Iran from now on in the context of Hormuz particularly, because China has to really secure its energy supplies in future. So are the Chinese really anticipating a weaker Iran or a dependent Iran on China in times to come? How do you really look at it?
Okay. I think China would approach the future role of Iran in a higher strategic level of thinking. As I mentioned earlier in the remarks that in the US-China competitions, China would prefer a US that is more distracted and at times spending its resources other places instead of focusing on the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. So from China's point of view, it would prefer Iran remain to, although unavoidably, Iran will face a time of recovering from this conflict. But overall, China would want Iran to maintain its rivalry status against the US and Israel, and leveraging Iran as a diplomatic asset for China to managing its relations with the Middle East countries, including the GCC big Arab countries. And also the most importantly for Iran to maintain its proxy network in the region, so as to pin down a considerable resources of the U.S. in Middle East, like for the past few decades. That would mean dragging the U.S. as a pivot to Asia or pivot to Indo-Pacific further postponed. So one point to look into this, what's the deal that coming out of the negotiations by Iran and the US. In this couple of days, we've seen some of the report that shows they're going to have this one-page memorandum, and some of those items that is being leaking out, it includes stop the enrichment for different time frames. And one thing that I would notice that I would especially pay attention to is whether Iran would commit to dissolve its hostility proxy network in this region, because that would be the nastier element of this conflict in this region. And also, that is also the item that can be tricky, because at one time, the Iranian can negotiate that they are willing to tone down the hostility of the proxy network, but it also provides plausible rooms for Iran to deny that they are continuing to nurture the proxy, because it can argue that the proxy has its own autonomous thinking and interest calculations. So that part is really tricky, and that is also the part that China can look on for the conflict or rivalry between Iran and the US to continue in the coming years. So I would say China can be relatively eased, even though Iran seems, to my point, Iran seems to be a little bit eager, wanted to negotiate with the US. And so at the beginning, Iran may try to negotiate something that is acceptable for the Trump administration, because Trump administration also is in a hurry before the midterm in November. Trump also wanted to deal with the oil prices issue. So the two sides also both have their concerns about the continued conflict. So they would probably wanted to reach some kind of a deal. But it come to me that I think maybe Trump also wanted to have some legacy. So Trump would probably wanted to pay its attention really on a nuclear-related deal. And on that, I think Iran probably could negotiate something as a deal, but it is not so much acceptable for the Iranians. So such as Iran may prolong the so-called stoppage of the enrichment programs. But at the same time, it could buy the time until Trump is not in the office, and then, or in the implicit way, it could continue the program like Iran already tricked the surveillance facilities for so long. And those situations, I think it's all acceptable for the Chinese. And so I think the situation is overall in a controllable space for the concerned parties. And I think one thing more ironic for me is that actually the problem in the region, like General mentioned, that it has impacts on the entire world. But it feels like many of our allies didn't really wanted to contribute or have their skins in the conflict, such as our European friends. They mentioned that they would be willing to contribute some forces to keep the strait open or help it remain open. But so far, we haven't seen much of the moves for them to contribute in setting up or gathering forces to promote the things to go heads to that direction. But I hope that during this short-term negotiation and the following 1 month negotiation time frame, maybe our international friends would find the window to jump in and contribute. Okay, I'll stop here.
Very good points, Noura. Thank you very much. Christian, your quick comments before we go for the final round. How do you really see China thinking about the future of Iran and its relationship with Iran?
I mean, before I breach that, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I think going back to what I mentioned earlier, so China's presence in the Gulf, I mean, just leaving aside Iran for a minute, I think is, as I mentioned earlier, still increasingly visible across ports, logistics, and kind of telecommunications, energy, and so on. I think clearly Beijing is wanting to build a long-term ecosystem of influence that supports both commercial resilience and geopolitical flexibility. And I think here the UAE is particularly important example of this trend. So I think from China's perspective, the UAE represents a far more supplier than energy. It's a stable logistical hub, financial gateway, aviation crossroads, Emirati ports, particularly those connected to global shipping and trans-shipping networks, are strategically valuable. The presence of Confucius institutes and Chinese language programs in the UAE, I think, reflect growing education and cultural engagement, while kind of commercial hubs such as Dragon Mart symbolizes kind of the more deeper integration of Chinese trade networks into the UAE consumer economy. Chinese construction firms, technology companies, logistical hubs, and infrastructure contractors, I think, have become increasingly active across the Emirates. And I think if you look at the expat percentage of Chinese expatriate communities in the Middle East, there's an estimated to be around 300 to 400,000 residents and business people, which are largely concentrated in Dubai. But I think, again, the Chinese strongly value diversification mechanisms, again, because I think they worry about choke point vulnerability, any conflict involving Iran, and that's where I'd like to kind of go back to Iran. The United States, Israel, or broader regional escalation could disrupt Hormuz shipping lanes and threaten Chinese energy supplies. So I think recent trade disruptions have reinforced, I think, Beijing's concerns. During the latest Hormuz-related crisis, China experienced a significant decline in trade with both Iran and the Gulf states. So Chinese exports to Iran reportedly dropped sharply, while trade volumes with several Gulf economies have also declined considerably amidst fears of shipping disruption and raising transport costs. So again, I think Chinese imports of Gulf energy products also fell during this period of heightened uncertainty. So I think, again, I think the message or the subtle message is that Chinese diplomacy converges with GCC priorities. I think while Beijing avoided directly criticizing Tehran, I think Chinese officials repeatedly emphasized the importance of keeping Hormuz open and preventing escalation. I think from a Gulf perspective, this creates potential opportunities for GCC states to use China as an additional channel of influence or restraint vis-a-vis China. But I think the Gulf states remain cautious. I think they welcome Chinese investment and diversification, but they're also aware that growing Chinese technological and strategical penetration can generate friction with Washington. So the UAE has already experienced pressure from the United States over Chinese technology partnerships, telecommunication, infrastructure, and I think concerns regarding like dual use facilities. So again, I think here the Gulf states increasingly pursue what is commonly described as strategic balancing. I mean, they seek economic gains from China while avoiding becoming trapped inside a binary US-China competitive framework. And again, I think the last point I want to make, and I know I didn't really focus too much on Iran here, but I think it's important to highlight that from a Gulf perspective, that China's influence operations in the region are often subtle rather than ideological. So I think Beijing generally avoids exporting political models or openly interfering in domestic governance, instead emphasizing themes that are attractive to Gulf governments like sovereignty, non-interference, economic modernization, infrastructure development, IA cooperation. So I think this resonates strongly with Gulf leadership pursuing national transformation agendas like the Saudi Vision 2030 or the UAE's post-oil diversification strategy.
Thank you, Christian. Now, there are some interesting questions in the Q&A box. Let me read it because roughly we have 20 minutes around. So let me read it one by one, and then you could pick and choose whatever you feel like answering. There is a question, whilst the talk is set at the diplomatic level, what are some of the malign activities carried out, if not by the PLA, by the proxy networks? Perhaps what happens when Iranian proxies meet Chinese proxies? That's an interesting point to make. Probably some of you would like to comment. Then there is a question, while Gadar is often touted as a Western gateway, its commercial growth has been slow. In a scenario where the Strait of Hormuz is fully blocked, does Gadar actually possess the inland pipeline and rail capacity to serve as a viable energy bypass for China by 2030? Maybe Christian and Gedalia, you would like to comment on this. Then there is a question on given the infrastructure damage Iran sustained in the recent war, is China likely to pivot its 25 years investment towards reconstruction diplomacy, or will the risk of further entanglement in Iran's regional rivalries regional rivalries cause Beijing to favor more stable partners like Saudi Arabia and UAE? Maybe Gedalia, you would like to comment. Dominic, you would like to comment on General Chun, you would like to comment on this. There is also a very direct and interesting question. What are the biggest constraints preventing China from assuming a larger maritime security role today? Maybe Norasan, you would be interested in addressing this point. Also, I have a general questions to everyone. Each one of you, directly or indirectly commented that probably China not necessarily looking at a weaker Iran. Rather, China is looking at a stable Iran, which is a very well taken point. But may I ask a larger question in the context of war? And I'll start with you, Gedalia, in the same order that we started the webinar. What are the three primary points that you note about China's role in this particular war and in the context of these regional complexities, both in the context of Iran-Israel-US war as well as in the regional complexity? What are the three critical points you would highlight and identify about China's role in this war? And you could mix it with other questions. Let's start with you. 5 to 7 minutes for you.
Thank you very much. Good questions. I would say in terms of the way China has behaved and looked at this war, I would say it's very much, as we mentioned earlier, very much a wait and see approach, a very gradual approach, then positioning itself as a mediator. So it had a few different opportunities to position itself in the global south, with other actors. We had the China-Pakistan five-point peace plan, for example, at some stage. It was very interesting to hear, for example, from my friends in Abu Dhabi that China was seen as I would say, a credible channel to convey messages to Iran during the war, right? So you had the American channel, which of course was very close for countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but they were also using the Chinese channel to convey messages during the war to the Iranians. So you have this in-between position that's on the regional front. So China was trying to balance between its different relationships in the region. And by the way, that includes Israel, right? Even in Israel, you'd see the Chinese ambassador and others trying to position themselves as this positive, stability-seeking power in the region. But on the geopolitical front, I think that China sees this as an opportunity on two fronts. One, this is an opportunity for China to promote its own model, which, as we said, is not a military model, it's a geoeconomic model, and to say, listen, even when the US and Israel together use their security and their military power combined, this doesn't fundamentally solve the problem, especially in the Gulf. Gulf countries are under attack, right? They're not safer, they're less safe. So I think China is likely to use this moving forward to say the American model, the American security in the Gulf has failed, and you should try or should double down on the Chinese model, which is more economic, and we'll see that playing out. So we will see the Chinese trying to use it to promote their own position in the Gulf longer term. Regarding the question of whether or not we'll see a diversion of investment from Iran to the UAE, for example, as I said earlier, I think we already have seen that. And we're seeing cooperation, as Christian said, in a lot of different areas, right? It's not only energy, it's technology, it's infrastructure, Vision 2030. China is trying to align with the visions for the future in the Gulf of Gulf countries. And this will only become stronger moving forward because now you also have these countries having to rebuild themselves, right? Or to reposition themselves as economic drivers. That being said, I think China is also thinking about doing the same in Iran, right? So unless there'll be a situation where, for example, as part of an agreement with the US, China will say, we're going to do less in Iran, I think China will want to enjoy the best of all worlds. And so far, that's the way it's positioning itself moving forward. I think one angle that we haven't discussed, and I think is important to think about, is what is China learning from the war in Iran and from the Hormuz situation that it can take back to the Indo-Pacific, right? So China has a very good example of American power and what it can learn from it. China is learning how to deal with the blocking of waterways, right? So it could prepare itself for the future. It can diversify its energy sources even more than it has done so far. So I think in that sense, this is a very good opportunity for China to learn a lot for a future or potential future conflict closer to home.
Yeah, thank you, Gedalia. General Chun?
Yes. So the first thing is North Korea is not a Chinese proxy, and especially not in the sense that Hamas or Hezbollah and forces in Iraq and they are a proxy of the Iranians. So I just want to state that in my view, North Korea is not a proxy of the Chinese. They will not do something that is not in their best interest. But going to your question about what is China's role during the past 2 months, I think, yes, I also believe that they've been in an observer mode. They want to see what's going on, what the capabilities are. They know that they have a high stakes in this because of their economic ties with the region, stability issues that have already been mentioned, but still they're being very prudent, as Chinese are always are, and they're in an observer mode. At the same time, they've been very prudent in being a silent supporter to the Iranians. We know that they've sent materials and equipment, intelligence support to the Iranians, and it has prolonged or given the Iranians confidence in what they're doing. So the Chinese, they're staying quiet, but at the same time, under the table, they're supporting Iran, which is, I guess, something that we should have expected. And so all of this to me is that China believes that the U.S. has made a mistake, that the United States cannot sustain this kind of war. And to them, they've always thought that the United States was a weak entity, that it lacked resolve. But I think they're surprised by what Trump has been doing, not only here, but in what he did in Venezuela. So this is a test bed for them, and that's why I think this is very, very critical. No matter whether you support or do not support the reasons for this whole situation, that we now sit in a situation where the United States must achieve its goals. And so China is looking very closely. As you said, they're learning lessons, and it is in our best interest that they learn the right lessons, which is you will not get away with acts of violence against another entity of people. So I hope that this conclusion is well received by the Chinese, and that the PRC does not go the path of Iran.
Yeah, that's very good, interesting points. Over to you, Nora-san.
Okay, thank you. I want to tackle the question first on what's the reason that constrains China to play a bigger maritime security role. I wanted to point it out that actually it's may well because the physical reason that China hasn't really set up those needed logistic posts along the sea lane. That is the biggest reason that China cannot play a bigger maritime security role. We look back to the development along the sea lane that we can see at the earliest time, that is in 2017, that China set up its first overseas military base, that is in Djibouti, that is 2017. And only recently, China set up the second one, that is the Rim base in Cambodia, that is 2025. So so far, we've seen only one officially military base overseas, one semi military base, that is Rim base. Along this very long sea lane, only 2 logistic posts there, so that constrains China. And also because we know that China so far hasn't have a nuclear powered carrier strike aircraft carrier strike group. That is why China need those posts to be set up at first. And but I think that is the direction that China wanted to build. So we noticed that in the past few years, China has been building up its battleships, like dropping the dumplings in the ocean. So that is the direction China wants to build, but it's just not time yet. So that's my observation and answer to this question. And this, the second question that you mentioned, that the 3 things that I would pay attention to during this event in Middle East, that is first, like I mentioned, that that is whether the negotiation and the resolve of this conflict would end up Iran maintain the rivalry status against the US and Israel or not. That is whether the current Iran regime maintain the power, or after a period of time of the resolve of the situation, will there be a regime change happening after this? That is first. And the second is, I think China would want to continue supply Iran and its proxy network to maintain the conflict in this region, and so China can leverage it as a diplomatic asset while dealing with the regional players. And also at the same time, because this layer of diplomatic relations, it also shields China from the potential damage and the risk that happens in this region. And the third one is, as mentioned by Christian, that we've seen China pouring in investment in not just the transportation infrastructure, but I think one thing very important is those communication infrastructure and so-called renewable energy infrastructure. Those are the points that provide entry point for China, because China is currently the world's largest scale renewable technologies, such as the batteries and the solar panel technologies that are produced by the Chinese companies. So that's the entry point for China to nurture these influences in this region. And also because in the communication infrastructure, I think it's particularly important because so far the GCC and Middle East countries, they rely on the security partnership with the US. And many of those communications would depend on a secured communication systems. That is why, like you mentioned, the UAE and I think other Middle East countries are facing pressures from the US in terms of using the Chinese-built communication infrastructures. That is a serious penetration into this region and intelligence network. So that is that is where I see we should pay attention to how the Middle East countries are taking care of this challenge and the risk. Thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you. Dominic?
Well, I don't have a clue to go with the questions, but let me just briefly go into China domestic. And I think it's critical to understand China's position vis-a-vis the world affairs, not only in the Middle East. However, we need to recognize that the Chinese National People's Congress just issued the 15th five-year plan. Very ambitious, with artificial intelligence as a leading force. And from this perspective, the Chinese Communist Party simply needs to have a stable energy sources. And from my perspective, there are two new dynamics into this. The first is integration of domestic market that is truly fragmented. And I will not go into details, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, Guangdong province is really trying to have a good deal with other provinces like Yunnan province and Guangxi, etc. Plus, increasingly, Southeast Asia will be more important when it comes to energy transactions. And if you just look into China, Laos, conversations and deals, we see, as I see here, the China-Laos interconnection is expected, additional Lao hydropower to support Guangdong from June. So at the end of the day, the crisis in the Middle East create two important narratives or directions in China. One is going towards self-reliance, and those narratives are pretty strong in mainland currently under Xi Jinping. And the second, strengthen relations with Southeast Asia, at least within the relations, asymmetrical relations with Southeast Asia, you can control the process. In the Middle East, Middle East is quite far away from mainland China. but China can really influence Southeast Asia. And I guess this is truly and important to recognize. So 3 points: 15 5-year plans. Then we have diversification, but integration of domestic market, plus stronger relations when it comes to energy sector, creating ecological problems in Southeast Asia. But there are 3 things the Chinese government learned from the Middle East conflict. Thank you.
Excellent points. Christian, your last thought, maybe you
Yeah,
would
let
like
me
to
just
address some
wrap
of
it
this.
up. I'd like to address the looking forward question that you had about Chinese, strategy regarding the Strait of Hormuz, looking into the future, like how it might likely become increasingly more integrated, multidimensional, and risk-oriented. So I think there are 3 major dimensions. First is diversification of routes. I think China will continue investing in overland and maritime corridors that reduce exclusive dependence on Hormuz. So this includes links through Pakistan, Central Asia, Indian Ocean, East Africa, and potentially even, I would say, Arctic shipping routes over the long term. Second, strategic infrastructure integration. So Beijing will likely deepen its involvement in Gulf ports, logistics chains, energy storage facilities, AI-enabled shipping management, and so on and so forth. Third, selective maritime security engagement. I think China may gradually expand naval access arrangements, anti-piracy cooperation, maritime surveillance partnerships, and naval diplomacy activities without, I would say, openly replicating the US military postures. So from a Gulf perspective, this evolution would obviously represent a significant strategic shift. So the Gulf states traditionally relied on the United States and Western naval powers for hard security guarantees in the Gulf maritime domain. I think China's future role may instead revolve around commercial security, that is protecting flows, infrastructure, shipping continuity. I think the Gulf states will still remain cautious about any developments that transforms Hormuz into an overt arena of Sino-American competition. And the last thing I would say is that China's relationship with Iran gives Beijing a unique position regarding Hormuz. It values Iran as an energy supplier, strategic partner, and geopolitical counterweight to Western pressure. Yet, I think Beijing also recognizes that Iran's coercive behavior in the Strait threatens broader regional stability and Chinese commercial interests. So, therefore, I think China's long-term objective may increasingly involve managing Iran rather than simply supporting it. And from a Gulf perspective, this is important. GCC states will closely watch whether China is willing to use its leverage with Tehran during future maritime crises.
Thank you, Christian. I think overall it was really a thought-provoking discussion. So one point which is clearly emerging from the discussion is that not only we have to observe the Chinese behavior and action plan, taking how the Chinese have behaved during the war and during the Hormuz crisis, but interestingly, as Dominic pointed out, we should look also the Chinese pattern of behavior in future perspective, particularly when they have released this 15th five-year plan, and there is an emphasis about looking at stable energy sources and how they want to integrate the domestic market with it, having a stronger supply chain connect with the overseas neighboring and extended neighboring countries. So in that context, both Hormuz and Iran are critical elements for China, and I think the time next few years is going to be very critical, not only from China's point of view for its energy quest, but also from the power politics that the region is witnessing currently. With this note, let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for your time today and also sharing your thoughts. This has been really a rich discussion, and I'm sure some of our participants or some of our followers who are very closely observing our Silk Cage webinar series. Those who have missed out, they will definitely hear this conversation and read the report. So we take this opportunity to thank you. I also take this opportunity to thank all those participants who have found time to join and listen and pose questions and making this webinar very engaging as far as discussion is concerned. Let me also thank my colleagues in ISDP, Anna Yarmuth and Seville and Ani for all the coordination for this webinar. We are tomorrow having another ISDP and YCAPS in Japan webinar on Hormuz 2030. If you have time, please register and join and listen to conversation. But we'll continue with our Silk Age webinar series in times to come. And also to each one of our speakers, we are going to engage with you more and more in times to come. Probably would be privileged to have you for our other events, and we'll stay engaged, of course. With this note, let me thank you again and have a good evening, good afternoon, and take care and have a good week ahead also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.